Hello, 8th grade, and welcome to yet another edition of Johnny Tremain, presented by, you guessed it, Mr. Z. This is the Chapter 8 edition. Chapter 8 is titled A World to Come, and it begins on page 185 in the Blue Book, of course. Before we begin reading Part 1, I would like to ask you two questions to guide your thoughts and comprehension for the first part of Chapter 8. Number 1. What has happened to Mr. Light and his household? And number 2. What responsibility does Cilla feel the need to fulfill? So we begin. Part 1 of Chapter 8. A World to Come. It was by chance Johnny saw the Light's ruby coach trundling slowly down Orange Street, heading for Milton and a little country air. The bright sun glittered on the gold eye, rising on the coach door, on the black sheen of the strong horses. He half wanted to stop the coach. "Don't you go to Milton, Miss Light? They are lying in wait for you out there." He could not bear to think of her tossed about by rough men, ridden on a rail. He could see her profile through the window. Cilla sat facing her. Isana, as befitted her higher station in the household, sat next to Miss Light. Only Isana was staring about, observing the lower classes milling about in the street. She looked straight at Johnny, and he at her. Neither gave any sign of recognition. It was not by chance Johnny next saw that ruby coach. Late in August, word was spread through Boston that Merchant Light had got it, or was going to get it, out in Milton. If driven from their country house, there was but one safe refuge for them, behind the British lines in Boston. Toward evening, Johnny began to hang about the gate. The farm carts, carrying food and fuel to Boston, were still coming in over the mud flats, connecting the town with the mainland. These the British guard at the gate, nearly 200 men were kept stationed there night and day, let pass. But when night really fell, the gates were closed, and most of the soldiers returned to the barracks. There were a few sentries on duty, and a handful of men, with a corporal, in the guardhouse. Johnny settled down to wait. He had been dozing, but woke quickly, hearing the sentries yell, and the corporal commanding the gates to be opened. Then, coming closer through the still summer night, the clatter of hoofs, the rumble of a coach, was a sickening, hair-raising howl, the howling of a human wolf pack. The corporal had not had time to get his tunic on, but he recognized the situation. Another of His Majesty's loyal supporters fleeing to Boston with the mob at its heels. "Torches only!" he was crying to his men. "No muskets! Death to any man who fires!" The unarmed soldiers ran out to meet the coach with great flaring torches in their hands. The mob already had stopped and was drifting back from whence it came, through the canopy of shaking orange light, and through the smell of burning pitch-black horses, whitened with lather and dragging a heavy ruby coach, slowly crawled to the safety of the gates. The gates shut behind them. The coach seemed disabled. The horses were almost spent. A torch flared up onto the coachman's face. It was twisted with fear. "Mr. Light yourself, sir?" the young corporal was saying, as he opened the door of the coach. "Let me assist you, sir. You've lost the wheel off your coach. Please to come to the guardhouse while you wait for another vehicle." Mr. Light, helped by the corporal, but even more by Miss Lavinia, did crawl from the coach. He tried to smile, but his lips drew back from the long, yellow teeth. Johnny had seen the identical expression on the face of a dead woodchuck. He was a desperately sick man. Lavinia's face showed no fear, only concern over her father's condition. Now she was telling the corporal that a doctor must be fetched, and she wanted Dr. Warren. "I know he's a rebel, but we do get him for me. He's the best doctor we have in town, and Papa must have the best." Her father, safely inside the guardhouse, Miss Lavinia came into the street a moment, gazing blankly at the disabled coach, and at the men carrying from it into the guardhouse such of their most precious possessions as they had had time to rescue from Milton. For the first time Johnny saw Cilla. She had been sitting on the box with the coachman. Now she went to Miss Light. "Somehow," she said, "the silver got left behind." "The silver?" Miss Light did not seem to be able to take anything but her father's sickness. "You told me to pack it up, but just as I had begun we heard the mob coming, and then Mr. Light had a fit." "Oh, yes, I remember. All that silver. Well," she was standing there in the street, watching for the sight of Dr. Warren's chaise. Isana, very good and quiet, was snuggled close to her, her hand in that of her patroness. "Oh, never mind, child," she said, with absent-minded kindness. "At least we are all safe, and if only Papa is well, and—" "I'm going back to Milton, miss, to get that silver before the riffraff steal it. Most likely they all have it already." Dr. Warren's chaise was drawing up beside the guardhouse. He was getting out. Miss Lavinia had no more thought of her silver. Johnny went up to Cilla. "Look, Syl," he said. "I'm here." "It was so mixed up at the end." The girl seemed to be trying to explain her error more to herself than to Johnny. "Mr. Light turned purple and fell. The mob was getting closer. It came earlier than Mrs. Bessie warned us." "Mrs. Bessie?" "Yes. She found out some way in the village." Johnny liked the old woman all the better that in the end she had been able to see a considerate master, whom she had served for 30 years, a young woman whom she had taken care of since she was a baby, humiliated, tossed about, torn by a mob. Sam Adams might respect her the less for this weakness. Johnny respected her the more. "Johnny, I've got to get back to Milton. I'm going to save that silver. It was my fault. But Miss Lavinia didn't seem to care. She didn't scold you. If she had, I wouldn't go. She thinks it has been stolen already. No. After smashing the gates and some windows, the mob left the house to chase us. We didn't dare to leave by the front drive. We started out through the haying fields, but they heard us and caught up, and we were getting away all right until, just on the neck, a wheel came off the coach. It was terrible. I've got to go back, though. And now. I'll go with you, but looks like we'll need a horse and a chaise. It's 7 miles. Dr. Warren was standing on the guardhouse steps, telling Miss Light that her father must be allowed to finish the night out on the bed the soldiers had made up for him. He was not to be moved, and never again must he be so upset over anything. From now on, as long as he lived, as she loved him, he was never to be angered or worried. The handsome girl was nodding, promising these impossible things. She went back to her father, still clutching Isana by the hand, and Johnny went to the doctor. Obviously, Dr. Warren did not want to lend his horse and chaise. He did not care what happened to the light silver, but he was a generous man. He let Johnny have his rig, and also wrote him a pass which would prevent any molestation from the Whig mobs, and told Cilla to get a similar pass from the British soldiers. Then they would be safe from either side. So at last, the gates once more swung slowly, heavily in. Beyond was darkness, and a dreary waste of land and sea. The doctor's little rabbit-eared mare flung herself forward. It would not take such a fast pacer long to get to Milton.